Yeah, perfect. Mr. Urbina is a journalist, which indeed has so much to tell us about the external story of European citizenship or lack of citizenship. Mr. Urbina, you have written many pieces of influential journalism. One of them, I think we're gonna put the link. We have put the link, awesome. One of them I recommend to everyone is about secretive Libyan prisons that allow people to keep migrants out of Europe. And it was awarded several prizes, and I highly recommend it for you also. General culture. You also wrote a bestseller, The Outlaw Ocean, and relatedly, you're also the founder of the Outlaw Ocean Project, which is a non-profit journalism organization, which is based in DC, and which produces investigative stories about human rights, environment and labor concerns on, and I quote, on the 2/3 of the planet covered by water, which is, I think, a number we often forget. Mr. Urbina, thank you so much for being available to us, and you have about 10 to 12 minutes.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to put a clock on myself, and I'll try to stick to the 10 minutes. My apologies for not having read the book yet, Professor Kochenuff, but I will do so. I'll try to divide my talk into two 5-minute sections. First, I'll try to very quickly sum up the nature and goal of the New Yorker piece and sort of what it was attempting to explain. And in some ways, the sort of reimagination of the Mediterranean migrant crisis that it sought to instill. The second 5 minutes, I'd like to, having listened to Professor Kochenuff, I'd like to see if there's a way for me to connect that line of reporting to some of the points that you made, because I think there are, and they quite fit well together, hand in glove. The New Yorker piece was a 10,000-word story. It was a focus on not a new topic to anyone in this room, which is the tragedy unfolding on the Mediterranean. It sought, though, to reconceptualize the global public's understanding of the reality there by, first of all, breaking down certain silos that have been, I think, manipulatively used by proponents of the migration policy that exists in the form of an invisible wall across the Mediterranean. The silos are ones in which they conceive of the various players as if they're operating on different teams. And so the thought was, let's re-explain this phenomena, this space, without that assumption being embedded. And let's try to pull the helicopter up to a higher altitude and get a bigger view on what's really happening here and who's being served. With that goal in mind, I'll say it from our perspective. What's happening on the water there is a war on migration. It is an EU designed, funded, equipped, led war on migration. That war, again, I'm speaking metaphorically here, really consists of 3 armed forces. There's an army, a navy, and an air force. The navy is the so-called Libyan Coast Guard. This is a historically unique armed force in that it's not like most other coast guards that typically face outward and are paid by the coastal nation to protect its border. The Libyan Coast Guard was created by the EU, largely by the Italians, equipped by the EU, largely by the Italians, and their mission is to face toward Libya, even though they're called the Libyan Coast Guard. And their true mission is to stop migrants from reaching Europe. The rhetoric around the mission of the Libyan Coast Guard is that they're engaged in humanitarian rescues. I put those terms in air quotes. The rescuing that they're supposedly doing is saving migrants from drowning or from being taken advantage of by migrants. The reality, rhetoric aside, of what they're doing is they're blocking migrants from reaching European shores, and they're returning those migrants, those refugees, to Libya. That's the Navy, metaphorically. The Air Force in this war on migration is Frontex. This is the EU border agency. They are funding, guiding, pulling intel from drones and airplanes that patrol the Mediterranean 24/7. That Air Force, metaphorically speaking, is calling in the coordinates of these migrant boats, and they are handing them off to coastal European players, mostly Italy, sometimes Malta, with the very explicit knowledge that those coastal players then hand it off to the Libyan Coast Guard immediately. And the Libyan Coast Guard is then empowered to go fetch these migrants before they make it all the way across. That's the Air Force in the war on migration. And the army in the war on migration is the landed militias that are based in mostly around Tripoli, but northern Libya. These are a constellation of 6 to a dozen distinct, powerful militias that have their own turf, that have their own detention facilities, and are essentially, and quite, not even essentially, are quite simply profiting quite heavily from the business model that is the processing and holding and extortion of tens of thousands of migrants that are held in these facilities. Okay. So if we rethink what's happening out there in this more holistic way, it makes it harder for the proponents of this policy to sleight of hand rhetorically claim that this is a humanitarian effort. It makes it harder for the relevant proponents of this policy to claim that, hey, what happens in the detention facilities, that's not our fault. That's the fault of the Libyan government. We're just the guys that fund the Libyan Coast Guard. No, you can no longer say that because you're part of the same war and you're being directed by the same policy and funder proponents. And therefore, a more honest reckoning with what's actually occurring there and who's being served is started. That was what the story aimed to do, and do so in an investigative way by putting forward the evidence needed, some of it quite new, that proved that the EU could no longer claim, a lack of knowledge of this or a lack of funding of that. The evidence is all there. Okay. Now, how many minutes in am I? So I can say I'm 6 minutes in. So 4 minutes. Now, how does any of this connect to a problematized, quite right, and polemicized questioning of the category of citizen? Well, a couple ways come to mind in listening to Professor. One is, I think that if you pull the helicopter up even higher and think more broadly, and for a moment say, hey, look, the notion of modern wealthy Western states, in this case the EU, spearheaded by Italy, but over in my neck of the woods in the US on the southern border with Mexico, if you look at these modern wealthy Western states and how they're handling this meta problem of climate migration and poverty and terrorism driven migration, which is only going to intensify in the next decades. And you look at the connection between both of these big players, the US and the EU, they're doing the same thing. They're outsourcing their most thorny problem to failed states, for very, very clear reasons. The US is doing it in Mexico and blocking Salvadorian and Guatemalan migrants and housing them in Mexico. Why? Because out of sight, out of mind, and also extra jurisdictional benefits adhered by keeping those people in Mexico not on US soil means no US reporters, no US advocates, no US lawyers. All of these things are made much easier when you proxy and outsource these challenges. Same thing that's happening in Libya by way of the EU, specifically with Italy, whereby a lot of these people are better kept from the perspective of those who support the invisible wall, are better kept not on the island of Lampedusa or in Italy or in Spain or Morocco or in Spain or Malta, but rather in Libya, because it's much easier to do what you want to do, which is prevent them from being here and affording them the rights that your taxpayers for decades have basically voted into law in the EU. By outsourcing this to these other players. Now, why is this relevant to citizenship? Because if you think of it, and this is a law school after all, if you think of this and really get down to the spirit of many of the humanitarian and progressive laws that were written into individual states or the EU or the US, often the most protective laws aimed at people, regardless of their citizenship, were aimed to prevent the state from doing something bad to those people, right? The motivation of that law wasn't let's make things nicer for Americans and protect Americans. It was let's prevent our government or other governments from doing horrific things to people. Now, citizenship starts coming into play when you want to do things, you want to keep someone in a detention facility without access to a lawyer, you want to be allowed to not have to answer questions from reporters, you want to basically be able to unilaterally ship them to a third country, but you can't do that if they're in Texas or Lampedusa, Italy. So, but you can do that if they are in Mexico or they are in Tripoli. And you can do that if someone else is doing it for you, namely the Libyan Coast Guard. The outcome is what you're hoping to occur, and the legality of it becomes possible because someone else is doing it for you. Well, if you look at the legal status of many of these laws, they weren't actually meant to just prevent the Italian state from doing those things to Italians. They were meant to prevent the Italian state or European players or American players from doing those things. Look at the history of rendition, for example, and US legal precedent on rendition or waterboarding. And the interesting fights, my father's a federal judge here in DC and have looked at this a lot. And you look at the interesting debates that emerged over, are we allowed to waterboard this guy? Well, where is he from and where do we have him? These are actual questions that the CIA and the FBI and federal courts wrangled with. And the ACLU lawyers or whomever were the players at the time said, wait a minute, those laws were not supposed to only apply to that person if they are American. They were supposed to apply to the US government exerting that type of behavior, period. So this is where citizenship is being used often in a way that initially was not intended, but often gets introduced in a self-serving fashion where states want to do things that often they're not allowed to do, but they're hiding behind the category of citizenship so that they can allow someone else to do something for them. So this is one point of connection that I would say, if you look at the Libyan and the Mediterranean migrant crisis, and you look at the egregious and clear violations of law, and you look at the players who are involved in them, whether it's the Libyan Coast Guard funded by the EU or Frontex funded by the EU, you have real cases of citizenship questions being used by the Italian government and others to attempt to claim that it's not their problem nor responsibility to ensure that that doesn't happen, even if they're handing the people off to other people who they know will do it to them anyway. And that's, I think, one place where maybe there's a useful conversation to have between the work we did and the work the professor's done. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for this, Mr. Urbina, and I look forward to coming back to you in the discussion. But I will directly move to a third speaker. Again, yes, awesome. So Professor Sarah Iglesias Sanchez from Madrid. Thank you so much for being here on Zoom as well. Awesome, thank you so much. So Professor Sanchez, you're Professor of European Law and Administrative Law at the Universidad Complutense de Madrid. I probably butchered that, I'm sorry. It's high time I learned Spanish. And you also worked at the European Court of Justice as a referendar and legal officer, which I think brings an amazing judicial experience to your work as well. But most importantly, I discovered by preparing this talk, I think the most important thing to share is that you did your LLM at Yale Law School 10 years ago, which makes me very proud. And looking forward to getting that degree as well. Without further ado, the floor is yours for about 10, 12 minutes. And again, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having invited me, for giving me the opportunity to be here 12 years after I left. I must confess that I have never set foot again on Yale Law School after the day I left, and not because I didn't want to, because I got trapped in teaching, and then at the court, and then when my reunion was supposed to be, the 10-year reunion, it was COVID, so bad luck, right? So I will have to wait for another 10 years to go there. It's also a pleasure to be here commenting Dimitri's book, because it's a long time since I haven't had the pleasure to debate with him, and this cannot be, right? Dimitri is one of the reference in citizenship literature in the European Union and in the world. And we have worked together in the past, we have collaborated a lot, but I think we haven't seen each other for quite a long time, and we haven't had the pleasure to debate. And it's a true honor to comment on his book, which I have here, like my passport that I could pull out and show it. And it's a book that I really enjoyed reading, even though I was deeply concerned. I couldn't sleep for a week when I read it, and I was thinking quite a lot in which terrible topic I have put my scholarship on, that I cannot find anything good after this book. And then I started to reconvert myself to my previous idea of citizenship. That's why I am really happy to have the possibility to discuss with Dimitri, because Dimitri's ideas tend to be radical and provocative. They have a lot of truth on them, but by this way of presenting things in a very crude way, he makes a legal status naked. He shows the reality of something that lawyers tend to build up with many decorations around, that makes citizenship as something that is positive, that is sought, that is cherished by every legal order. And I wonder whether we could achieve a middle ground between what is the portrait of citizenship in Dimitri's book and what is the portrait of citizenship that we want for ourselves. In Dimitri's book, we have like a mission. Dimitri has a mission, and this mission is dismantling the mythical glories of the status of citizenship, and he does that through historical examples, through legal examples. The book is not written as a legal text, but the most important point of the book is that it contains an enormous legal background. It's like the distillation of a decade or more than a decade of legal studies, very well researched, that arrive at this point of destination, that citizenship is like a Machiavellian tool or an instrumentalization of the state to provide for global inequality, right? So it is not only the point that Dimitri shows that it's excluding immigrants or people who doesn't belong on racist grounds, but also Dimitri portrays citizenship as a vehicle of sexism, subjugation of women, political control. So it's an instrument that is depicted as politically motivated and openly racist. And the true concept of citizenship is discovered with this instrumentalistic approach. And there is something that also the book is telling us, is that citizenship is not about identity. And this is something that really was very surprising for me to hear, because one of the points that are really strong in the citizenship discourse is the nation, the building of an identity for the nation, the relationship with the problematic relationship with nationality, and all of this plays a secondary role. And it's this global story that Dimitri is trying to tell, which arrives at this very crude and pessimistic view of citizenship. So and I quote him, he tells in the book that citizenship, what it's about, is precisely about mass-case assignment in a context where individual agency and the personal characteristics are dismissed. So it's the contrary of what we are trying to strive for in a liberal democracy, right? And yet we are, all our societies are tied to citizenship. And this is this is a little bit what I want to discuss with him, what I want to push him in the discussion, and I'm sure he will come up with an answer, because he already started to casting some light by explaining a bit more on EU citizenship. And my professional deformation is being an EU lawyer, and that is why I will focus a little bit more on EU citizenship, but we could also think about federal citizenship and the positive aspects of it from a democratic and even anti-racist point of view. There are also stories to be told about positive outcomes that have come from the federalization or the pulling up of citizenship to a higher level. And Dimitri was already starting to speak about EU citizenship as something that is quite revolutionary, putting together into a citizenship that is built upon national statuses, but it adds something to them and is additional. It does away with borders. It creates an equal status. It has limitations, of course. It's not a federal citizenship, but still solidarity is strong. It's not as simple as Dimitri has very quickly gone through it. The limits of solidarity are there, but it is not as easy as saying, okay, you are poor, you are out. It's much more complex for it. There are safeguards, there are legal safeguards, there is judicial review, and the limits for solidarity are quite elastic, even though subject to interpretation. And most of all, it is not the Court of Justice who is putting out there these limitations. It's the federated states who have put them there. And this is part of a process. We are still not at the end of the process. And this is how many of us want to look at it. So we are still in a process, but I wonder, and this is one of the questions I want to put out to Dimitri, it is even worth to go further in this process of building up EU citizenship, because the book is telling us, okay, even if you go beyond and you truly create a super citizenship that is complete for EU citizens, what you are creating is a super exclusionary citizenship, right? Because we are trapped in this fate of citizenship as being exclusionary, and it seems that it's an unavoidable fate. It's like inherent to human nature. It appears from the book because with instruments, with examples from many different geographical points and many different points in history, we arrive at the same result. Citizenship always ends up excluding somebody. And the question is, can we do it otherwise? Can we organize ourselves politically, doing away with the notion of tying individuals to borders and status? Can we build up a citizenship based on residence and physical presence with open borders? I'm, of course, alluding to the eternal debate of open borders, and you mentioned Christian Jobke, but there are many others who have extensively researched on that. Are you really, when thinking about this idea of citizenship and criticizing it that harshly, do you have an alternative in mind? How shall we look at the future? How shall we build on EU citizenship further, profiting from this experiment that we have? And here I would like to rescue two debates on EU citizenship that are quite interesting for that idea. The first one is this idea that seems a little bit dead, of civic citizenship, that was floated around in the beginning of the years 2000 when the common migration policy started to be out there. There was a big hope that EU citizenship could be expanded to legally resident third country nationals as an experiment of finally and completely decoupling nationality from citizenship. We had a legal basis to create this long-term residence directive and to create something that will resemble civic citizenship. But the EU legislature did something in between. It was not what we expected, at least what the scholars expected. It was a half-hearted legislation, still with some free movement rights for legally resident third country nationals, but that was an idea. And this idea of giving rights directly from the Union to third country nationals has been expanded. And not only the long-term residence directive, but the single permit directive, the students, the researchers directive. So I'm completely not in agreement with what Dimitri said, that EU law disappears for foreigners, for non-EU citizens. We have a common migration policy, which is not completely developed, which has a lot of loopholes and deficiencies, but which extends the non-discrimination principle for third country legally resident, that's true, in a great array of areas, and where the court is interpreting this by analogy to EU citizenship law. So this is also a part of EU law that is under research, that is evolving, the true status of aliens under EU law, their direct relationship with the union, their federal status, their incipient rights of free movement. I did my PhD thesis more than 12 years ago, or I don't know how many years ago already, on this precisely. And it hasn't evolved a lot, but well, the idea is here. And I don't want to talk too much about this, but once we have this idea here, I would like to push Dimitri's ideas, because I know he has a lot of ideas on many topics of citizenship, and also linking his portrait in his marvelous index of nationalities, but also the work he has done regarding Brexit and other topics, which are not immediately reflected on this book. There is something that I personally wanted to speak with Dimitri for a long time, and it's the idea of keeping citizenship for UK citizens after the UK abandoned the European Union. And I know he has very strong visions on it. But for me, that would have been an experiment for civic citizenship as well, and for trying to decouple citizenship from this idea of nationality, and from creating a true citizenship from the point of view of a union which grants and unmatched generosity to people that were their own for a long time, and that they decided democratically to leave, to be out of the club, to be members of this other, or to stop being members of this community. But I wonder whether these limits and this bad idea, this exclusionary content of the idea of citizenship couldn't have worked as well as turning citizenship into something voluntary, that we can voluntarily keep if we wanted to, decoupling this from the status of nationality. And would have been a positive development. I know that he thinks that no, not at all, but I think that his ideas on this topic would help us round this negative picture of citizenship. And well, that's the final thought about all this. What is your normative claim, Dimitri, for citizenship for the future? How do we move forward? Now you have destroyed all my illusions of building a legal concept of citizenship that works. What is your normative claim then? How shall we organize the status of being part of a territorial community that is organized territorially, because the law is organized territorially? Is a model based on residence, on democracy, or what is your take on it? I'm sorry that I actually just focus on the book, but I find the claims in the book quite important and very worth discussing, and I stopped here. Thank you very much.
All right, hopefully you can hear us again. Thank you so much. And also apologies for the mishap on the question thing. Just an FYI, Antoine de Spiegel is actually Professor Markowitz on Zoom. So you've been assumed by that. But it's okay, Lena didn't send anything awkward. And so at the end, if you have questions from Zoom, you can raise your hand and then you can unmute yourself. People in the cloud. Thank you so much, Professor. A lot of pushback, which I was hoping we would get, and I think Professor Kuchinov is dying to answer. But first, of course, we have some time for our last speaker and faculty discussant, Professor Markovits. I think it would be shameful if I had to introduce you in this room, but apparently, it's good courtesy to do so. So you're the Guido Calabresi professor here, focused on private law, moral and political philosophy, behavioral economics, many other things. The Meritocratic Trap, if I remember the title correctly, is a great book, that one of the only books I read from the YLS faculty before coming here, to be honest. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this for us. You have the floor, and then we can go to the discussion.
I think I will be fewer than 10 minutes so that we can get to discussions. And really what I just want to do is just try to clarify certain relations among ideas. That's, I think, what my role can be here. And let's just start with something that I think nobody can deny, or at least nobody can reasonably deny, which is that there's enormous global inequality. Not just inequality, but injustice. Not just injustice, but oppression. And that this global oppression is connected to the ways in which different persons are distinctively juridically related to different states. Okay? And in particular, certain persons get certain privileges within certain states, and then certain persons get differential privileges to move across states. And moreover, the free movement of persons is for all persons materially less free than the free movement of goods, or especially the free movement of capital. But it's more or less free for certain persons than for other persons. And this produces, what is commonly called the Birthright Lottery. If you are born in the US or in Switzerland or in New Zealand, you are materially better off in all of your life chances than if you were born in Sierra Leone or in Peru, or for that matter, in Moscow, in Russia. And that's connected to something about the way in which, if you are born in Switzerland, you are related to the Swiss state. Whereas if you are born in Sierra Leone, you're related to the Sierra Leonese state. So that's, I think, nothing anyone can reasonably reject. Now, the question is, what role does citizenship play in that state of affairs, either causally or constitutively? And one way to think about that question is to start looking at, well, what is distinctive about citizenship as opposed to other ways in which persons can be related to states? Any form of politics or governance will need to have a relationship between persons and states. And so what are the other models that are available? So one is subjection. That's the way in which persons are related to monarchies. So the person is the personal plaything of the privileged monarch. That's one alternative to citizenship. Another alternative is nationality. This is a way in which persons are related to states through certain forms of ethno-national coherence. That's another alternative to citizenship. Another possibility, which doesn't commonly get named, is something like administratorship. That is to say, a persons might be governed by technocratic rationalities of one sort or another. And the relationship may be that they are under the rationalized control of the states that control them. And that's a very actually internally diverse way of managing persons. So certain kinds of multinational autocracies have this character. The Soviet Union probably had this character. But also, the international human rights regime has this character. It's just an enlightened rationality that governs the relations among persons and states. And maybe one of the most promising alternatives to citizenship actually is something like the international human rights regime. Query how that would be run in a world in which there's politics as we understand it. But that's an interesting set of questions. And then there's citizenship. And citizenship is the distinctive form of relation between persons and states that govern them that is associated with the idea of something like pure political membership and something like popular sovereignty. The idea is that the sovereign is the collection of citizens, and the state is something like the delegatee of the sovereign. So that's another way in which citizens can relate to states in a republican tradition. And that's actually quite an old idea. I think, as far as I know, it was invented, in fact, by the Romans in the Antonine Constitution and the Edict of Caracalla in 212 AD, which made every male person non-slave, under the jurisdiction of the Roman Empire, into equally a citizen of Rome. And so it didn't matter what your ethnicity was, what your nationality was, what your location was, you were a citizen of Rome, and this was a pure political relationship. And it created a certain kind of citizen idea, really, I think, for the first time in human history, it skipped. And then it disappeared from the world for many, many centuries when we had monarchies, then we had national states, then we had multinational empires of various sorts. And then citizenship came back into the world, with the French and US revolutions, and had the history that you're jumping into. And now the question I think we want to ask is, what's the relationship between that peculiar form of citizenship and the massive global inequality and oppression that we are seeing? And I think that's a very complicated question, actually. It's a complicated question causally. Now, partly it's a complicated question causally because causal questions at this scale are always instances of counterfactual causation. And counterfactual causation is epistemically and metaphysically complicated anyway. So what is the counterfactual to citizenship that we have to assess when we know how much of the evil that we begin by observing should be causally attributed to citizenship? Very, very hard to say. And some things, I think we disagree on some factual claims. So for example, over the past 50 years, intra-state inequality has been rising, but global inequality has been decreasing quite dramatically. That's true also, incidentally, for the EU. Within EU, member state inequality has been rising, but across EU inequality has been falling. Is that related to the citizenship regime or not? That's a good question. I don't have a confident view about it. So there's a causal claim we might investigate, but then there may also be a constitutive claim. And this is a place where I think there's a kind of critique of citizenship which is worth pursuing, which goes something like this, and then I'll stop, which is that the idea of sovereignty is connected to the thoughts that the entitlement of the individual person to services from the state, to entry to the state, is connected to the state's claim of a certain kind of authority over that person. And that the reason why, as a US citizen, I can enter the US, or the reason why, as a German citizen, I can enter Germany, but I can also work, but I also get Kindergeld, but I also get all sorts of support, is that Germany asserts a kind of authority over me that it does not assert over non-citizens. And as it were, the normative price of that authority is the rights and benefits that citizenship gives. And internally, that looks like an emancipatory and egalitarian phenomenon. But trans-state, it looks like a way of laundering a set of injustices, because the individual state can say, we don't owe you, the Sri Lankan, the same benefits and duties that we owe the German, because we don't assert authority over you. We confront you with brute force, and that's okay. Why? Because since we don't assert authority, we are, as it were, in the state of nature vis-a-vis you. There's some international law, but it's thin, it's limited, and that's it. And what citizenship does is it launders that distinction. And that may be a bad thing about it. And it may be connected to the kinds of injustices that we're describing. But, of course, if it's to be abandoned, we still need a relationship between the individual and the state that claims authority over them. And there's a possibility of a world state, which would just be citizenship writ large, so a republican world. Or there's a possibility of something like an international human rights regime, which has all of the problems of its apolitical, technocratic, and fundamentally hierarchical nature, even as it's substantively egalitarian. And so, the place to end is, once we've clarified that citizenship is this very particular form of relation between the person and the state that claims authority over them, it becomes vividly clear that if we are to get rid of it, we need an alternative relation. And the question then arises, what will that alternative relation do, including in respect of the forms of inequality, injustice, and oppression, whose existence motivates the critique of citizenship? I think that's where I'll stop, and people should jump in as they wish.
I think we can start with you, Mr. Kosher. Just to remark, I know that Ian Urbina has to leave at 1:30 sharp, and it's already 1:16, so we have to keep that in mind. But I think you deserve the floor because you have received many questions.
Yeah, there are plenty of amazing engagements. Thank you so much, Professor Markowitz. I think all of them connect very well, especially what Professor Markowitz said and what Professor Iglesias Sanchez also voiced in terms of criticism. And I think the counterexample to the world of citizenship as a separation between the inside and the outside is precisely the European Union. So I can immediately applaud what Sarah was mentioning on the screen, and that is an absolute prohibition of mistreating those whom you don't claim for yourself in your own law and the supranational law that also binds you. So in this sense, it's not the relationship between a particular polity and the person that is the driver of how we treat the other, but our own law and the law probably above us as states that prohibits us from humiliating, dispossessing, torturing, etc., those whom we don't claim for ourselves. And I think there is no contradiction between the world of citizenship as we know it from the textbooks going back to the Roman antiquity or wherever we choose to start. And this basic legal reality, which we actually have in place in the European Union. The trouble is that in the European Union, well, citizenship is still citizenship with all its pros and cons. So only the citizenships of the members of the Union count. And we see it very vividly in the Mediterranean. If there would be an Italian crossing in his yacht from the Libyan coast to Lampedusa, then no Libyan coast guard would ever kidnap that person and keep indefinitely in an EU-funded prison, awaiting ransom from his or her Italian family. So this kind of global relationship between the state and the person defines our rights, or the lack of rights everywhere in the world. And the trouble here is precisely the consequentials of this carte blanche that is given to those states or those authorities who want to humiliate, discriminate, etc., based on the pretext of citizenship. So to me, the European Union is actually a positive example of how you can think about this relationship differently, and it shows the way that towards a reality where we don't need to speak about a global state or world state. And world citizenship in order to turn citizenship into something that doesn't actually harm people for no reason at all. Because the connection here is that unfortunately human rights regime as interpreted now it works in such a way that states don't conceive themselves as owing any rights, however minimal, to those who are on the other side of the sea, on the other side of the barbed wire fence. And this is even a violation of their own law. Very often. So what we see on the Polish-Belarusian border is a barrage of statements from the European Commission that says, unfortunately, we realize that the Poles do violate Polish law and European law, but we will help them because there is a crisis, because there are all these guys in the forest on the other side of the border. So citizenship is basically a pretext, a lawful pretext to discriminate. And I think it doesn't have to be a lawful pretext to discriminate. And the very last point probably is that the majority of countries in the world don't have a functioning democracy. So to present and all of them have citizenship as a relationship between the authority and the person, which means that using democracy as a justification for the status quo is not really convincing, since it's simply not present in the world of the majority of the citizenry of the world today. So when we speak about, and this is what Professor Iglesias Sanchez mentioned, when we speak about citizenship as governing the lives of all of us, it doesn't, I fear, apply in a positive sense to, again, the citizens of those places which don't actually give a status that comes accompanied with rights. All those Central Africans, Malagashans, etc., and they need to be helped and work the same way. So this is the first minimum response.
Awesome. Yeah. We should probably stay here until 8 p.m. to talk about all these things. It's very complex. I'm wondering, I could either open it to our guests on Zoom if you have anything you want to contribute at this point, or open the floor for questions as well, keeping the time in mind. So keep your question as a question and not a very long comment like I usually do. Any replies from our speakers? Otherwise, I also have, of course, 100 questions, but I want to give you the opportunity, Professor Iglesias or Mr. Urbina, to jump in.
I guess I would throw in one point, which is a very predictable point that a journalist would make in the company of academics. But I do think that there are two intellectual exercises here that are both worthy. One is a discussion about what is the best definition of citizenship. Is the current category of citizenship the one that really is one that makes for better societies? In other words, these are conceptual questions, ideational questions, philosophical questions, and important ones. There's a separate type of question, I think, which is having to do with checking the gap between rhetoric and reality, or the gap between concept and application. So that's a separate sort of question that also can exercise, that also could be exerted around citizenship. And what that would look like in my head, and is closer to my passion as a former academic, now journalist, is, well, let's set aside for a moment the very important discussion about the definition of citizenship, and let's look at the gap between citizenship as it's defined and citizenship as it's actually applied. And how are the current uses of citizenship dishonest in their rhetoric when you actually look at their application? And in what ways are states actually using citizenship and its definition to do harmful things? Those are all in the realm that I am personally very interested in, more so than the ideational questions. And it gets us closer to real world examples of this chasm between important, again, I'm not meaning to sound pejorative, but it's just this other species of analysis towards the ways in which citizenship presently, especially in the EU, is used to do things that actually go against the very spirit of what citizenship was supposed to support. So I would just for a moment, especially again as a law school, as a place where you're both breeding young minds of thought and also people of action who are going to apply the law, I think like really forcing the discussion over into the applications is also worthy.
So I think that just to jump in, Ian, I think that's right, but I want to add one more twist to this, which is that there's a third question we can ask, which is, to what degree does the internal construction of the concepts that describe the ideal world in fact contribute to either creating or disguising the gap between those concepts as they're ideally constructed and as they're applied in the actual world? And so, the left critique of liberalism precisely claims in various ways, various forms of critical theory, we can talk forever about how the details work out, but precisely claims that it's a feature of certain ideas like citizenship that they contribute to the disguise and the rationalization of the failure to provide the entitlements that they describe to most people. And one can believe that's true or believe that's false, or one can believe that actually it's just nonsense, and that what we have is the concept and the world, and the reason the world departs from the concept has very little to do with the concept. That's another view you can have. But all these are possibilities, and we want to get clear about which one we're interested in.
Thank you, Professor Markowitz. I see we have a question on Zoom, and also, Michael, if Professor Iglesias wants to jump in, please feel free to. But so the question is from, wait, I can't hear from my place. That's very problematic.
I think I'm unmuting somebody, yes?
Awesome, great. Welcome.
Shahab, I hope you've unmuted yourself.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, Professor Dimitri, it was, it was great discussion. I'm just going to order your book straight away. So I'm a PhD student at King's College London, so talking from right here in London. So I wanted to ask, because my introduction to citizenship began because I'm a scholar in discrimination law. And in the law of discrimination, in the theory of discrimination law, the starting point is that there are certain things in life in which, on the basis of which you can discriminate. And you start within your family and in your private spheres of life, there are certain identities, and then it moves on to certain spheres of life in which you can discriminate. And the famous judge quote that to say in a court that women are not allowed is very different to say that in a toilet. So it's more about which kind of expulsions you can legitimize and which kind of expulsions you cannot. So are you, while arguing in your book or even otherwise, are you trying to make a kind of bifurcation that we can still live with citizenship? And these are the kinds of areas in which we can say that people can be differentiated or discriminated, or these are the kind of areas in which it's wrongful? So this kind of argument. Thank you.
Well, that's the main function of citizenship, I think. A carte blanche to discriminate without giving any reasons. And the European Union, which was the starting point of my thinking about citizenship and the starting point of this book, is precisely a legal system that outlawed this kind of discrimination. So it shows to the world that it's actually possible to have citizenship in place, which doesn't necessarily undermine the life chances of those who benefit from this kind of framing of the concept. And the European Union has been growing successfully over the years. So more and more countries joined at different levels of socioeconomic development, and all that was not it didn't have as a result the obstruction of this non-discrimination on the basis of nationality starting point. And what we see is that while it could lead the world towards a new understanding of citizenship, a citizenship which is not harsh on the face of it, which doesn't have this necessarily discriminating function, the European Union failed to capitalize on this by becoming harsher on those who are not citizens, and harsher to the point of killing them, imprisoning them, probably not directly through European officers, but by outsourcing that. But it became an actor of injustice once it's turning in the direction of those whom it doesn't claim to itself as those who belong. So I think this is something that we can deal with as the world, and this is not the way how rationally we can best organize living together on Earth. And in this sense, I subscribe to what Ayat Shakar was claiming, to what Branko Milanovic shows in terms of the effects of citizenship, and plenty of others. So how to do it is of course a different way of starting a different debate. But ideally, citizenship should not be consequential, and this is something that the Union shows us. And non-consequential citizenship is probably no citizenship. So citizenship abolitionism should be one of the ways of thinking about how we mistreat people and why, and how human rights put into the picture.
Awesome, thank you so much. I'm mindful of the time. We have literally 24 seconds before 1:30. But I wonder, perhaps Professor Iglesias, you want to say one last thing as short as possible, and then we
yes, I am very much in tune with the debate, but focusing again in the construct of European citizenship, I think that it is not the category of EU citizenship what is in the origin of these terrible things happening. It is another corpus of legal rules, practices, and combination between national and EU law, which is in the origin of all this. And in fact, EU citizenship has proven to be positive in that realm, because even the most important developments helping parents of illegal children has come as a consequence of a liberal concept of EU citizenship. And this is something where the European Court and EU law has been prepared to go even much further than US law when helping the parents, the illegal parents of citizens. And here the taboos have been broken, and EU law is prepared to even protect the demonized illegal citizen or illegal immigrant in order to help the child citizen. So I think that these two areas, that repressive against migrants and asylum seekers, this side is not so much connected to the development and well, positive elements of EU citizenship. So for me, these two phenomena need to be separated, and we don't need to think that advancing in creating a stronger EU citizenship is going to lead us to a more racist or exclusionary element. For me, both positive outcomes are possible, and we have seen some positive elements from this relationship. So that was all.
Thank you so much. And once again, thank you all, our two guests on Zoom and also our two speakers in person. I think a good round of applause for this amazing discussion. Every time we hosted an event with the Yale Law School European Law Association, we felt that time was too short, even when we do an hour and a half, which is frustrating, but luckily we have some light summer reading. So if you haven't picked up your book, we still have a couple, so run and catch one. And thank you so much for your time, and see you all very soon.
Sorry, I've got to.
All right.